All right, folks, welcome. I'm Steve Shields, one of the vice presidents of RAS Korea, and we're happy to welcome Sanko Lewis with us tonight, who's going to answer all of our questions about Korean body movements and all of those interesting things. I'm looking forward to this martial arts and dance comparison. On behalf of Brother Anthony, the RAS president, and the council, I welcome you to lecture number 1430. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally organized in London in the early 1800s. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, which was the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their second year of support. We also thank our members tonight who've paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea. We appreciate your support. Those in attendance tonight who are not yet paid members, we invite you to consider becoming a member. See our website at raskb.com, and I will, in the chat box, add a note with all the links in it for you. For those who are visiting tonight, we suggest a one-time contribution of 10,000 won or 10 US dollars. Full-time students may contribute 5,000 won or $5. The donation page on the screen has those transfer information places, and then as I said, I'll post it in the box. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Sanko Lewis, who has lived and taught in Korea for more than 12 years. He began his martial arts journey when he took up taekwondo as a teenager in South Africa. His interest in Korean martial arts expanded to Korean body culture, which led him to take up other Korean martial arts such as Taekwondo and Hapkido, as well as training in Korean dance and percussion. As always, after the lecture, there will be time for questions. So now we'll turn the time over to Dr. Lewis. Take it away, Sanko.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And maybe I have some friends from South Africa joining in, so it will be good morning to you, or good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk about this idea of body culture. So I am going to share my screen occasionally and then just pop back again to my face intermittently. Let's see how this works. I've hosted a Zoom lecture before, but I haven't done it as the guest rather than the host. So I hope you can see my screen being shared.
We can see it. If you want to hit your slideshow function, it'll get rid of the menus for us, I think.
Okay. So I think that is better.
There we go. Yeah, very good.
And I don't know, can you see my face as well at the same time?
Yes, we can. We see both.
Okay.
So you don't need to go back and forth.
Yes, so we'll keep it like this. So the topic being movement characteristics of Korean traditional dance and martial arts. When I write academically, I would say the kinetic characteristics, but that is just to sound fancy. So let's start with this quotation, which I really like. It says, "Dance is not a creation of a single individual, but an entire culture developed by many people through the ages, gradually changing and being polished over time. As such, it is a valuable cultural heritage that embodies the character and emotions of people and reflects the spirit of the times. Each movement and each step in dance, therefore, imparts a sense of history and lives of people of the past. And this quotation can be adapted to include martial arts as well. And I really like this idea because it shows us that dance it's a cultural product, and it's not one person that came up with it. It's the contribution of many people, of the whole culture, slowly adding to this thing that we know as dance, and also what we know as martial arts. Now, I thought I'd give a little bit of a background of why I became interested in traditional Korean body movement. I started martial arts as a teenager. Actually, my brother, if you see the picture on the left of the three guys with blue belts, I am the ginger boy. I was maybe 17 years old at that time, 16 or 17. And my brother is the tall one standing on the opposite side. The two of us started doing martial arts together. Actually, we wanted to do some Chinese martial art, Kung Fu. But in the town where we grew up in South Africa, there was no such a thing. And then one day we kind of accidentally stumbled onto this thing called taekwondo. We had no idea what it was. There was an advertisement that said, it's like in the movie, The Best of the Best. We had seen that movie from the 80s, I think. And we went for a class, and both of us were just hooked from that very first day. But we had really no idea about Korea or taekwondo or any of the things that I would start to love and research many decades later. So that was about 25 years ago that I started with taekwondo. And then I came to Korea the first time maybe in 2000, I think it was 2006 or 2007, in the middle of that year, just as an English teacher. But because by this time I was completely enthralled by Orientalism, that very romantic idea of what East Asia is like. And especially the type of taekwondo that I practiced had lots of history and philosophy imbued into the system. So as you progress through the ranks, you learn about all these historic figures and so on. Of course, I had a completely romanticized idea of Korea. I expected everybody to be walking around in hanbok. High was my disappointment when I came here and nobody was wearing hanbok at that time. Nevertheless, when I came to Korea, I started to search for other martial arts to train as well. Some of you may know that there are different branches of taekwondo. The two main branches is what is known as ITF Taekwondo, or the International Taekwondo Federation, and WT Taekwondo, or World Taekwondo, also known as Kuki Taekwondo or Olympic Taekwondo. So the type of Taekwondo I started with is known as ITF Taekwondo. It has more of a traditional slant to the style, more focused on self-defense and what you would typically associate with traditional martial arts. The other version of taekwondo is the Olympic style, and that is what is here in South Korea almost exclusively. So if you go to nearly any taekwondo school in South Korea, you will find mostly Olympic style taekwondo being practiced. And that is not what I was interested in, because it was so modern. It had shed off much of the traditional elements that fascinated me. And this ITF Taekwondo that I practiced was doing a peculiar thing. Now, when I started doing Taekwondo, it was an older version of Taekwondo in South Africa. And some of you may know this, some people don't know because there's lots of misinformation about Taekwondo history, is that Taekwondo actually evolved out of karate, a Japanese martial arts. This is highly controversial. Many Koreans don't like the idea, but it is a fact. Taekwondo, when it evolved, it started with the main material, which was Shotokan karate mostly. This was Korean people that trained karate during the Japanese occupation. After the occupation, they returned to Korea. There were about 5 original instructors that started to teach karate in Korea. They used different names for it. They would call it Dang Sudo. Dang is Chinese, like the Tang dynasty. Su is the Hanja for hand. So Chinese hand way, that's a literal translation of the original Hanja that was used for karate. And kara meaning China and te meaning hand. The Japanese also didn't like this idea that the martial art they are practicing is named after a Chinese source. So they changed that first character kara to mean empty. So karate became empty hand. And therefore in Korea, you also saw some gongsudo, the changed name being taught here. But basically, they all taught karate, Japanese in origin, but this changed. So from around the late 60s, especially in the 70s, this Koreanized karate underwent very quick evolutionary changes. And these changes changed this martial art from what was originally Japanese to something that now had undeniably Korean DNA or Korean movement as part of it. Anyway, so when I started doing taekwondo, my taekwondo resembled karate in the way we moved. It was very stiff, very rigid, very tense in the movement. As you moved, you tried to keep your head kind of flat. There's no strange bouncy movements and so on. But in 1999, taekwondo started to change even in South Africa. We had some people coming from abroad starting to introduce a new way of movement. So in the 1990s, this happened. And so what I originally learned had to change. And at first I was very uncomfortable with these weird changes, and they called this change at the time sine wave movement. So you have to move like a wave, like a sine wave. At first, I was very much against it. Later, I would embrace it. And now I won't call myself a defender of the sine wave movement, but much of my research started with why do Taekwondo now move in this weird way that doesn't make sense to me? So when I came to Korea the first time, I took up Hapkido because I noticed that in the taekwondo I was doing, the movements have changed from a very angular way of moving to a kind of rounded way of moving. Now, unfortunately, if I was the camera that cannot show my body well, if I was giving this lecture in person, I would have done lots of physical demonstrations in person, but I will try to do what I can within the small frame of the screen. So for instance, in karate, if you were to do a block, the block would pull back to the head and go straight out towards the target. But in taekwondo, this angular movement disappeared and it became more a kind of an arc-shaped movement. There was still a crossing of the hands, but it was not very angular like this, but instead there was an arc movement. The same happened with the punch. In karate, when you do a punch, you pull the fist back to your hip and then you shoot the fist straight out to the target in a very straight line. This changed in taekwondo, especially the version that I learned. Instead of pulling it back to the hip and straight to the target, we started doing it in a kind of an arc. So you would pull your hand back and then propel it to the target in an arc. So I decided, okay, I am going to do Hapkido because Hapkido has lots of circular movements. So maybe that will help me to understand these movements better. It did help me to understand the movements better, but it turns out that Hapkido also has an origin in Japanese martial arts. So that didn't really give me the insight that I wanted. So next I decided, okay, I will practice Taekwondo because Taekwondo is a more traditional style, and that's what I did. And very quickly I noticed, okay, this is what's happening. Now I understand why did ITF Taekwondo change from the way it used to be into this very strange new way of moving. And at first I thought, okay, maybe ITF Taekwondo was inspired by Taekwondo because there were some rumors that Taekwondo, the original Taekwondo instructors, those original Taekwondo pioneers, had knowledge about Taekwondo, but this turned out to be mostly not true. Most of them didn't really have any knowledge of the native martial arts of Korea. They basically only practiced karate, Japanese martial arts. Some of them had knowledge of Western boxing or of judo, but not really of the native martial arts. But what I learned in time was that this was something that was embedded in Korean culture, a particular way of moving that's embedded in Korean culture. And I have an interest in dance, so I would often go to dance performances. I would often watch Korean traditional dance performances, and then I would notice these same movements being repeated in traditional dance performances. So what I did was I decided, okay, I'm not only going to watch it, I am going to take some lessons. So I started to take dance lessons. Later, I took some percussion lessons, samulnori, specifically the jangu, the hourglass drum. All of this was in an attempt to understand Korean movement better and try and see the commonalities between these different disciplines. Let me grab some water. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of ethnographic research. So this is basically what I did first informally, just because of my own interest in Taekwondo, and then later more formally through the years. So ethnographic research requires like field-based research. You have to be in the culture that you are studying, either as an outside observer, this is called ethic, or emic, in which you become one of the subjects within the culture and try to do it like that. Now, informally, I was an emic member of the martial arts community because I took up the martial arts, first with Taekwondo, later with Hapkido, then Taekyon and cross training and all kinds of different martial arts. But at first for the dance, it was just ethic. I would just go to these these dance performances as an audience member and just appreciate it from a distance, and of course making notes, seeing similarities. I would sometimes go to these dance performances and just look at martial arts movements throughout the performance, which is a weird way to look at the dance performance. In any case, later on I decided to also take some lessons. I took lessons from the National Theatre of Korea in traditional dance. I think 2 semesters for dance, 2 semesters for samulnori. And recently I even had an interview with a pansori singer. With recently, I mean just a few days ago on Sunday, talking about these aspects. So ethnographic research is also inductive. You are not searching, you don't start with a hypothesis and try to prove or disprove it. You are just kind of gathering data and trying to find patterns or general rules or principles from all the data. So this is what I did. I practiced these martial arts and I tried to figure out what are the similarities, what are the commonalities between the martial arts, between the dance movements, and so on. And I would also watch other martial arts. For instance, I might talk a little bit about Shilum, the wrestling form tonight. So although I haven't practiced Shilum personally, I have watched it live at competitions and online competitions and spoken with some people involved in Shilem and so on. So another aspect of ethnographic research is that it's often dialogic. It's part, you have a dialogue. So I come up with ideas and then I go to the dancers and the choreographers and the martial artists and the martial art masters. And I tell them, you know, I have an idea about this way of movement. Do you agree with it? So they would give some feedback, yes or no, this is not how we understand it, and so on. So it's a dialogue, and it's continually changing and evolving as you gather more data and see more connections between all of this. The way to kind of prove your ethnographic research is through triangulation. In other words, trying to get the data from many different areas and see if there's enough overlap to validate your findings. So firstly, I did my personal experience partaking in these activities, watching these activities, and then taking notations. And then I would do interviews. Many of the interviews were informal. So like after a dance performance, I would quickly go and see if I can find the choreographer or some of the dancers and just talk with them about what I felt, what I sensed, and get feedback with them. Occasionally it was formal interviews with some of these people. And then finally, I would search for published works. So research things that have been written on dance, on martial arts, and so on. The tricky bit is that they don't use the same vocabulary. So a movement in dance might be named one thing, and in a martial art, completely something else. And in a different martial art, it might have a different name. So that's always the tricky bit. And I think that was what probably took the longest time for me, was to build up a big enough of vocabulary and way to talk about these things with these different disciplines. And then something else that is common in ethnographic research is it takes a lot of time. In my case, it took over 10 years of actually trying to find similarities. I have over 25 years of martial arts experience, but at first there was no ethnographic research. It was just doing it for the fun of it. But later, when I moved to Korea, formally moved to Korea about 12 years ago, I really started to go to these places, meet these people with whom I can discuss these ideas. So all of this culminated finally, after about 10 years, I felt confident enough to talk about Korean body culture as if I knew anything about it, being an outsider to the culture. So last year, November, I went to a Korean Martial Arts Alliance conference where I presented my ideas in front of an audience of primarily Korean martial artists. And thankfully, they agreed mostly with me, and they were quite enthusiastic of how I was able to describe the things that they are doing. So that was the first validation that I got, that all these years of personal research was not a useless one. And then this year, I submitted a chapter to this book by UNESCO. It's part of their Living Heritage series, and this book just came out. I just picked up my copy. They sent me a few copies, and I just got it in my office today. And this book contains a chapter in which I discuss Korean body culture in traditional dance and martial arts. And the book launch will be on Thursday, this coming Thursday, in Chunju. And I will give a shortened version of today's speech, today's talk to them. Basically, I'm going to summarize the chapter. So there's, I don't know if how much the book is, but the book is freely available as a PDF online. So if you go to UNESCO ICM, that is International Center for Martial Arts, you can find a free version of this book in which many martial arts are discussed as intangible cultural heritage, including my chapter, which is chapter 15 in this book. So I'm talking about this idea of traditional, and that is always kind of a tricky thing. What does it mean when you say something is traditional? You know, because something that was traditional 100 years ago might be completely forgotten. Something that is traditional today might become traditional in a few years from now. So it's kind of a weird thing. What do we call traditional? And even there are invented traditional movements. I use the term to categorize those movements that are trying to keep a certain way of moving, a certain way of cultural movement, and a specific cultural aesthetic. So even in the martial arts, where you think everything should be all about combat effectiveness, even in martial arts, there's a sense of beauty. And oftentimes that beauty, whatever is considered beautiful, is based on a cultural idea, a cultural aesthetic. So we can compare traditional dance that is trying to keep certain principles of movement and compare that with contemporary dance, where you are free to discard any principles of movement. You can move in any way. Or traditional martial arts, usually martial arts have the sense of a lineage, moving in according to a tradition that's been passed down. And you compare that with mixed martial arts, which is you just combine techniques from anything. Any type of technique that works is fine. It doesn't matter how it looks, where it comes from. It is okay. So this is the difference when we talk about traditional and something that is non-traditional. So I generally use the term traditional as it's understood within Korean society. If you talk about traditional dance, Korean people have an idea, oh, it's this type of dance and not K-pop dance. Or if you talk about traditional martial arts, Korean people would have a specific idea of what that is, compared to modern manifestations like the things we see at UFC, or imported martial arts such as Muay Thai, that is a Thai martial art from Thailand, or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's a Jiu-Jitsu that originated, Jiu-Jitsu originated in Japan, but then it went to Brazil, where it undergone some changes. These two martial arts are quite popular now here in South Korea, both Thai boxing and Jiu-Jitsu, but they are important. And if you ask a Korean, is that a traditional martial art? They would probably say no. But Thai boxing is traditional in Thailand. It's just not traditional here in Korea, because here it is part of the UFC and MMA movements. So just that idea. So when we talk about traditional, it is a term that is quite relative, but I'm sure you have a notion when I say, oh, traditional dance, you will have a picture of what I'm talking about. So for some reason, there it's moved. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 7 movement characteristics that I've identified through the years. At first I had 8, and then I combined 2 of them together to make 7. The thing is, they often overlap. So when I refer to these different movements, you might also see how these things kind of overlap and how one influenced the other. The first one is an erect posture. Next, it is abdominal breathing, specifically danjon hohab, danjon breathing. Furthermore, it's expanding and contracting. The term therefore is gulshin, combined with ogumjil. Ogumjil is the bending of the inside of the joint, like the back of the knee. Fourth one is Korea's 3-beat rhythm. That's part of traditional Korean music. Fifth, kinetic chaining. And 6, naturally curved lines and motions. Ending with number 7, counterbalanced motions. And these things work in synergy. It is not a single one of them that makes it a Korean traditional movement. They often need to have several of these aspects working together, and many other dances, let's say movement from Japanese dance, will also have an erect posture, but in Japanese movement, the rhythm is different. Instead of this kind of 3-beat rhythm, they will have a 2-beat rhythm, and so on. So it's the synergy of these elements that gives Korean traditional movement a Korean flavor, if I could use that expression. I think it is time for us to quickly look at a video to give you a sense of what I am talking about. So I'm going to stop sharing now and then try to share a video I have for us on YouTube. Let me find it. I think it's this one. Trying to skip the ads, and I'm going to skip ahead to around 2 minutes. Okay, so I want you to notice how she is bending and straightening her knees. Every time she goes up, it coincides with an in-breath, and as she drops down, that is the out-breath. Also notice that her arms are kind of extending as she goes up and breathing in as if she's being inflated. As she exhales, the air goes out and the arms deflate down. Notice also that it's synchronized in a counterbalanced way. The hand that is in front will switch, and the hand that is in back will switch to the front again. Notice also the movements of the arms are very gentle, very curvy, and it moves in a kind of kinetic chain. First, the movement starts in the breaths, and the knees move up into the shoulders. The arms are extended into the fingertips, and then everything is relaxed again, going down from the fingertips into the arms, and the knees are dropping down. So if you just see this, this specific movement, it's a very basic dance movement called waist coiling, because the arms are coiling around the waist. If you understand this movement, then you understand traditional Korean body movement, because everything I'm going to talk about is there. Let me move back to the PowerPoint. Okay, let's start with this first principle, and it is an erect posture or a straight spine. This one is probably the most controversial of my 7 points, because if when I share this point with these Korean performing artists, that's the one they are uneasy with, because sometimes they do bend the body a little bit. And the same with the martial arts. There are techniques where the body is bent, but when you see it in its totality, when I bring these movements together and I take out this element, then the whole thing seems to collapse. So it seems like this is an important point to keep with the others, even though some people might disagree with me. So basically, traditional Korean dance will keep an upright body posture with the shoulders over the hips, the head nice and upright. It is not stiff. It is not like ballet, for instance, where the shoulders are pulled back, a chest forward, a very kind of stiff uprightness. No, it must be a kind of a natural upright position. The hips are not gyrating, because that is seen as too sexual within the Confucian sensibilities. So there's no gyrating of the hips. Think of belly dancing, for instance, where the hip moves independently from the rest of the body. Now, the hips and the shoulders are often kept squared. Sometimes they will use power generation from the hip, but it is a very practical function. It's not an aesthetic function. So generally, head, shoulders, hips are all aligned. Sometimes in folk dancing, for instance, some of the folk dancing, they might have kind of suggestive movements with the hips, but that is just for a comic effect. Generally, you won't see that in most dances. Even though the body is upright, you might see the shoulders slightly bent forward and the chest a little bit concave, especially among women. And again, this is to kind of de-emphasize the female anatomy, to take away any kind of suggestiveness, sexual suggestiveness from the dance. Almost never will you see postures very low on the ground, no crouching or crawling. Think of b-boy movements. In b-boy dance, there's lots of things happening on the floor. That is not something you would easily see within Korean dance at all. Sometimes the wings, the arms are kind of stretched, hug outwards to create a type of embrace like the wings of a bird. And I will show some examples of that soon. In the martial arts as well, here's a good example. So you see the wings or the arms are extended and slightly forward, just like the red crested crane, which is considered a very beautiful bird within East Asia and especially here in Korea. In the martial arts, this erect posture is directly related to equilibrium, to balance. So if you think of the folk game Taekwondo, where the primary goal is to topple your opponent by sweeping them or throwing them, if their posture is bad, it would be so much more easy to get them to fall down. So erect posture is very important for that. So the posture that is not erect and therefore unbalanced will result in easier takedowns. Now, there is some branches of Taekwondo where during their basic training, they kind of sway their bodies and push their hips forward, but this is more a kind of hip joint exercise. That's not how they would actually perform fighting. And the modern martial arts like Taekwondo and Hapkido are also pretty much upright martial arts. There's a slight respite when you do throwing techniques. When you throw somebody, then you would bend your posture, but otherwise it's upright. The exception here, of course, is a grappling martial art like Shilem. But even in Shilem, when the two fighters are pushing against each other, they will keep the spine straight. So the spine will not curve. The spine is kept straight, so the core muscles are engaged. Let's move on to here's some comparisons for you to see, because sometimes it's so abstract when I talk about these things. But if you see some other martial arts or other dance forms where this is not the case, then it's easier to conceptualize. The first picture there is of an Indian dancer. Notice how his spine is curved sideways. This type of curvature you would almost never see within the traditional Korean dances. And almost never in the martial arts as well. The picture in the middle of the two people in white uniforms, they are doing capoeira. Capoeira is a Brazilian martial art. Notice how the head, the shoulders, and the hips are not aligned. They kind of bend over and slightly crouching posture. Even in Western boxing, that is the picture way on the right. I don't know if it's obscured by our images, but in Western boxing, the shoulders sometimes come forward, and it is to hide the chin so that somebody cannot knock you out easily. These types of crouching, rounding of the shoulders, or skewing of the spine's line is something that you would almost never see in Korean dance, traditional dance, and Korean traditional martial arts. Let's move on to the second point here, and that is Danjon breathing. I think I should hurry up a bit. So Danjon is a area in the body. So if you are familiar with yoga, you might be familiar of the sacral chakra, which is the second chakra from the bottom, usually depicted as an orange color. So it's basically below the navel and towards the center of the body. That is the Danjon. And Danjon Hohab, Hohab means kind of a breathing exercise or breathing. So Danjon breathing is possibly the most important thing in Korean dance and martial arts. So proper breathing is very effective for all physical activity. If you don't breathe well, you won't be able to do your techniques in a strong way. In Korean dance, there's a strong connection between the spinal alignment and the breath. So they would call the breath line, or 호흡선, breathing line. 호흡선 is the same as the backbone line, 척추선. 척추선 and 호흡선. It's kind of the same concept. So if you want to have a good posture, you should breathe in the proper way. And if you want to breathe in the proper way, you should have this good posture. In the martial arts, it's the same as well. Good posture goes together. Slouch posture is not only bad for your balance, but it also inhibits proper breathing. And especially in East Asian martial arts, there's the idea that energy is through the breath. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of gi or qi in Chinese, which can roughly translate as breath or air, energy. In Korean dance and Korean martial arts, both emphasize this Danjon breathing. It is a type of abdominal breathing. So when you breathe in, the body expands or grows. When you breathe out, the body shrinks back, including your height will go up and down. The idea is that you don't breathe in the lungs, but you breathe lower down from the Danjon. So for the inhalation, it's envisioned as if the breath is rising in your body, and they would call it rising breath or sumul olida. And when you exhale, the breath is sinking or descending, sumul nerida, in that way. So in Korean dance, the movement starts with the breath. If you think back of the video that I showed you, the dancer would start with her knees slightly bent. As she breathes in, her knees move up, her body expands, that energy of the breath moves into the shoulders, through the arms, and in the end might end in a flick in the fingers. And as she breathes out, the fingers kind of collapse, the arms come back to the body, and everything settles down. So in Korean dance, all movements begin with the breath and end with the breath. And it is the same with the traditional martial arts. It starts with the breath and it usually culminates. The technique ends with a strong out breath. In the martial arts, they use the term gihap, kind of energy that is harmonized for this. And gihap is often a type of shout that is used, but sometimes it doesn't need to be vocal. It can just be a strong breath and exhalation. In Taekwondo, they have a verbalized ik and ik when they do their movements. The ik is kind of a tension and then release with the k at the end. ITF taekwondo, for instance, don't usually vocalize the gi up. It's just a very strong movement, exhalation that is clenching the body. And immediately after, there's a relaxation. In dance, you would see the dancer go up, and it seems like they are suspended in the air as they have all that air within them. And then they would just relax in a sigh and everything would drop down. So even though there's this emphasis on breathing, specifically Danjon breathing, the breathing should not be stiff or forced. It should be a type of comfortable breathing. Pyon Anhan Hohep is used for that. Let's move on to the next one. The next point is the idea of gulshin. So gulshin means kind of expansion and contraction. So to expand and to contract. And this gulshin starts with the breath. So there's a subtle form of it and a more expressive form. The subtle form is simply when you breathe. Every time you breathe in, slightly your body will extend, your spine will extend, and every time you breathe out, everything goes down just a little bit. But it also manifests in the limbs, as you saw with the dancer. When she went up, her arms would go up to the side. As she relaxes and breathes out, the arms kind of collapse again. So the body expands with the rising and the moving up or out, and then with the exhalation, the body contracts, sinks, move in and down again. This extending and bending of the knees, the knee joints, is known as ogumjil. So that's the other main point I have there. Ogumjil. Ogum is the inside of a joint, like the inside of the elbow, the inside of the hip, and the inside of the knee. Usually when they use this term ogumjil, it's referring to the back of the knee. Jil here means movement. So when you step with this ogumjil, it creates a wave-like movement, sometimes called mulgyoljil, or wave-like wave movement in the stepping. Taekyon particularly emphasizes this kind of gulshin and ogumjil in their basic stepping. And I might show us a little video. Let's see if I can find this video quickly. So I'm moving back to YouTube. Okay, so here you see a person stepping. Every time they are stepping, they kind of bend the knee in a very conspicuous manner. So the weight, the body weight really goes into the floor with each of these steps. By the way, notice that he is stepping in a triangular way using a 3-beat, and we will talk about that in more detail later. Again, I'm seeing some questions. I will try and answer these questions later. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. So this kind of stepping creates what some people call verticality, or type of vertical oscillation. In the dance, you would often see the dancers go up and down in a wave-like movement. In the martial arts as well, there's another video that I might would like to show you where you can see this type of up and down movement in Taekwondo. It is not limited to the knees only. In traditional dance, this up and down movement in the knees might be called ogum chum. Ogum is the knees and chum dance. But sometimes you see it even in the shoulders, then it's called oke chum or shoulder dance. And in its exaggerated form, it gives the idea of horse riding. So some people believe that maybe this type of bounciness came from old history in Korea, where the warriors would move with their horses across the plains, maybe all the way back to Mongolian times. I'm not sure about that. But nevertheless, you do get a sense of the shoulders going up and down. In some of the folk dances, they might exaggerate it so much that they would lift the shoulders up and kind of propel them up in the air, and then relax the shoulders so hard that it kind of presses them into the floor, even into a type of crouched position. So because of this ogumjil, the knee bending motion, we find that many of the Korean martial arts tend to move in this way. Karate, for instance, it is anathema to have your head going up and down throughout the movement. You should keep your head level when you are stepping, but Taekwondo, it is quite okay for you to move your head up and down. And let me quickly show you a video of this. So this is a form called Gebek Tul, Gebek named after General Gebek. It's performed here by a Russian taekwondoist called, her name is Alexandra Khan. And I want you to notice how she bends her knees while doing all these different movements. Now, if you were to do karate, this type of knee bending would be completely wrong. It would be a wrong way of movement. But in ITF Taekwondo, this is the expected way of movement. And you notice a similar type of knee bending when we looked at that basic movement from Taekwondo as well. Okay, let's stop there. It sounds like the sound is still. So in ITF Taekwondo, this kind of knee bending or ogumjil is referred to as knee spring movement, and the shape of that type of moving is often called bow-shaped waveform in the Korean literature, hwaldung pado, the back of the bow, or sine wave motion in English. And in Kuki Taekwondo or Olympic Taekwondo, you would often see the athletes kind of bouncing on their feet while sparring. Some researchers say that this bouncing on the feet has boxing origins because Koreans were introduced to Western boxing. It might be the case, but Japan also were introduced to Western boxing, but they never adopted this bouncing movements. But the Koreans did adopt it because it was part of their body culture. Next thing to talk about here is the 3-beat rhythm. Traditional Korean music follows a 3-beat rhythm, usually with an downbeat start and an upbeat cadence. In Taekwondo, they would actually step in this 3-beat. In ITF Taekwondo, that we watched previously, there's a 3-beat for every movement. First, it starts with a relaxation, then a rising, and then an execution of the technique. Is somebody asking something? No. And of course, this rhythm is forgotten or left out during actual combat, because if you keep to a fixed rhythm, then your movements are very predictable. But in the basic training, they would do these basic 3-beat rhythm. Moving on to kinetic chaining, number 5. This is kind of sequential flow of movement from one body part to an adjacent body part. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it starts with the breath, usually then from the knees up, and it moves out to the extended body parts and so on. What you won't get is just a movement by itself. So let's say in boxing, you might get a jab, the arm extends without a rest of the body moving. In these types of traditional martial arts, you will not get that. The whole body moves in a sequence of one muscle group building on the acceleration of the next muscle group and so on. So starting maybe from the hips, then the shoulder, then the arm extends, and maybe lastly, the flick of the wrist. So rather than just flicking the arm by itself, the whole body moves building on the movement that preceded it. And we see this also in the dance. The movement begins centrally and progresses sequentially to the peripheral body parts. In the martial arts, the reason for this is also for power generation. So you start with a big muscle group, you accelerate that big muscle group, and then you use the next muscle group, builds on the acceleration of the previous muscle group, and so on, until you have the combined momentum and the combined force of all these different muscle groups. In Korean, they sometimes refer also to balgyong. Balgyong is a term that is used in Chinese as well as fajin in Chinese. Another word that they might use in Korean is chejikjiu. Chejik is whip, so a whipping motion. So just as a whip would uncoil and snap at the end, that's the type of movement you expect as well. Number 6 is naturally curved lines. So this is the most aesthetic of these principles, and it's often useful to compare. Think of the Korean hanbok with its curvy shape, especially the woman's dress. That curvy shaped lines, or under the sleeves, you might find this natural curve. Now think of the kimono, the Japanese traditional dress, kimono, with its very straight lines. So this is a very much a cultural aesthetic. Koreans believe that natural curves are beautiful, and it might be because of the rolling mountains in Korea, or these interesting curved shapes of the Korean pine tree that influenced their aesthetic. But you see it all out traditional Korean art, and in architecture as well, in the uniforms, in the painting and so on. This idea that lines should not be very straight. In lots of Japanese aesthetic, there's a Shinto idea that straight is good. A straight line is a good line. Whereas in Korea, a natural curve is considered good or beautiful. And the Korean word for that is gokseonmi, the idea of natural curves being beautiful, gokseonmi. And we see this in both the martial arts and the dance. And in the martial arts, this curved lines is a natural consequence of the kinetic chaining, where one muscle group builds on that of another muscle group, so that the movement uncoils in a wave-like motion. So that's where the curved lines come from in the martial arts as well. Bringing us now to number 7, and that's the idea of counterbalanced motions. Now, I spoke a little bit about this when we looked at the dancer bringing her one hand to the front and the other hand to the back in that waist coiling movement. You also see this in hand rotation. So one palm would be up, the other palm would be down, and they would change their hands like this in a counterbalance way. it doesn't need to be symmetrical. So it can be maybe one hand extended up and then the opposite foot extended out to create this type of counterbalance. In the martial arts, this counterbalance often has a practical function. Firstly, it is as a physical counterbalance. So imagine you are kicking very powerfully. The momentum of your kick can pull you off balance. So what they would do is they would pull the arms in the opposite direction. You might see this in the picture at the top, where they are extending the leg out in a kick and they are pulling their arms in the opposite direction to cause a counterbalance to help with literal equilibrium. But it may also have a practical function as a push and pull. So Taekwondo or Shirim, you might find that they are pushing the upper body while pulling the knee to cause somebody to fall, or the pulling hand in some traditional martial arts where you actually grab onto somebody and punch them while pulling with that grabbing hand, the pulling hand called dangi ninson. And this is often also interpreted in a philosophical way as the yin and yang, or yang in Korean, as an expression of taeguk, of the natural balance. Now, I don't think I have that much time left, so I wanted to mention quickly how Taekwondo is moving away from this. Originally, I mentioned Taekwondo was Japanese in origin, and early Taekwondo, if we look at the videos, if we see what they did, if we even look at the books, it's basically a copy of karate. But in the late 60s and 70s, it changed. They started to adapt these principles. We started to see the use of gulshin and ogumjil in the way that they were moving. Danjon breathing was very important. The uncoiling of movements rather than kind of stiff movements that move kind of the hip, the shoulder, and the arm moving at the same time. You would now get the hip, then the shoulder, then the arm extending, or the same with the legs. So they started to employ these principles, Korean kinetic characteristics. And by the 1980s, Taekwondo was undoubtedly a new martial art. It was not Korean or Japanese anymore. It was definitely now a Korean martial art. And then something happened again in the late 1990s and in the 2000s. The first was the Olympic rules that changed. And these rules, I don't have much time now, so maybe I can go into that later if somebody asks the question. The rules caused the martial art to lose some of these movement characteristics. And then later on, with the popularity of K-pop, we see that happening as well. The rhythms of K-pop is now introduced. Instead of the 3-beat rhythm, we now have syncopated rhythms based on hip-hop music, which is a completely different musical DNA. And it changed the way, it is changing the way Taekwondo is being practiced at the moment. So to summarize, these are the kinetic characteristics. We have start with an erect posture, then danjon breathing, and breathing happening, movement happening from the danjon. Gulshin is the expansion and contraction of the body. This can also be an yang, expressed in an yang way. This expansion and contraction is most noticeable in the bending of the knee, called ogumjil. And this bending of the knee creates a verticality or vertical oscillation of the body when stepping. And this coincides with a 3-beat rhythm. Often movements occur in a kinetic chain rather than a movement happening singularly by itself, just like extending the arm like this. That would be a completely wrong way of moving. You have to uncoil the movement to do it like a whip motion. This results in naturally curved lines. And in the case where it doesn't result in naturally curved lines, they would actually try to show naturally curved lines in the dances because it is considered more beautiful according to the Korean aesthetic. And movements often work in a balanced or counterbalanced way. If one hand comes to the front, the other hand might be retracted to the back. If one hand goes inward, another arm also might cross over inwards. So there's some blocks maybe in some of the martial arts where you block in and the other hand comes in like this or goes up like that. So when you strike forward, you might strike up at the same time. When you punch, the opposite hand is pulled backwards, and the same occurs with the dancing. And with kicks as well, you might kick with one foot and then pull your weight in a counterbalanced way to the other side with your arms. So this might also have practical functioning for the grabbing, pulling and pushing that we see in wrestling motions. So taekwondo is changing again, and it's changing away from traditional movement for various reasons. One of it being the influence, in my opinion, of the popularity of K-pop. K-pop has its origins in hip-hop music, including urban dance movements that source from various different types of dancing using different types of syncopated rhythms and not the traditional rhythms that we expect in traditional dance. And this is where I will end for now.
Thank you very much. If we were in a room together, we'd all be clapping wildly. Appreciate your very interesting lecture about this movement. I've been engaged in Korea for about 45 years and have never thought of these things in this way. As you noted earlier, there is a question in the chat box from Raymond. Can you read that question, okay, and provide an answer for him, please?
So, wait, let me just see. Where is the question? Chat.
Chat, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to read the question out loud. As a professional dancer myself, I'm wondering how you mentally manage to make the leap from a combative discipline to a performing form like dance, which also requires an emotional connection with the audience. Well, let me start by saying that I'm not a professional dancer. So I've only performed in front of an audience dancing once. It was quite an experience. I enjoyed it, but it's not something I regularly do. So I won't say that I really had to make the leap trying thinking about an audience in general. So for me, in all cases, it's just the joy of movement. So I enjoy the martial art activity. I enjoy moving. And when I do dance, it's for the same reason. I just enjoy moving. So I don't really think about the audience. I only had to do that for dancing once when I performed with some traditional dancers. It was actually a fusion of contemporary and traditional movement. And then for the martial arts, occasionally when you do competition, there's the performance of the form in front of an audience. And I used to do that a lot. But again, if you want to perform well, you should ignore the audience. You should be really focused in the moment. So I'm not sure about dance. I guess some entertainers would feed off the energy of the audience. But in the martial arts, it is not the case. You want to be in the moment, in your body, really engaged with your space. And I'm guessing dance might be similar, where you kind of lose yourself in the movement and ignore what happens around you. I hope that answers your question adequately, Raymond.
Anyone else? Just go ahead and unmute your mic and Speak up, please.
Yes, I have a question.
Go ahead.
John?
First of all, it's very interesting. I'm happy that this is being recorded because what you presented here is something that each part I could spend quite a bit of time thinking about. And I have some experience. I was in a Korean farmers band in the 1970s. I played the Ching and the Gwangari, and I practiced taekwondo and kendo. And now I'm older, I'm doing Tai Chi. And one thing that you didn't touch on is the idea of mot in Korea, which I don't know how to translate, but people say moshiyasa. That's really fine. There's something there that's very attractive about it. And that's very important in Korean dance. And you were in Salmonori. And, you know, I've seen many performances, and Kim Duk-soo, I mean, he's the master and very impressive. But in my farmers band, our leader who played the Gwangari, she was an extraordinary artist, and she had mot. And when I go to see the Salmonori, I see some kind of furious technique that's really exciting. But when this woman, and we performed under a tent. We were traveling like circus in the small towns in Cholado, and she's still living. But when she would do her Gwangari Nori, it was amazing. It was epic. I would sit there, and you know, they have the hat. I don't know if you can see me, it's dark in this room, but they had the hat with crane feathers, and she would play the Gwangari, and she would do that hat. And I guess you know that the farmer's band was originally used in warfare. And I guess the instruments and all, the rhythms and all would tell them to retreat or advance or whatever. And the hat, I assume, was if it was too noisy or something, you could get a message. I don't know how that worked. I don't know if anyone really knows. But when this woman would play her solo, nothing else, I mean, it was epic. You know, it was like I could jump up behind her with a stave and just follow her into battle. And I think she is still living, and I just wish someone would go down and record what she was able to do with this little piece of metal. And she had mot. So whenever I see a farmer's band now, I'm a little disappointed because it's exciting to be in it, but to watch it is different because you aren't spinning and you aren't flipping your head with the crane feathers and all. So anyway, that's one thing you might want to investigate is the connection between mot and martial arts, because in martial arts, of course, I've seen Tai Chi performances, championships on YouTube, and I've seen Tai Chi done with unbelievable mot. You know, I just go out and just wish I was young enough to just begin to try to train my body to do what I've seen. And usually it's women. I don't know. I guess the men can do it too. But anyway, mot is something that I think is interesting. And another thing that I would like to mention is it's very curious to me why Koreans have so little interest in Tai Chi. You know, I know it originated in China, but so did calligraphy. And many, many Koreans practice calligraphy, but you almost never see anyone practicing Tai Chi. And sometimes they see me doing it and they know what I am doing, but I've always wondered why older Koreans, that's a martial art that you can do up until you die. And it's very good for your balance and your joints, and you know about that. And I've always wondered why they don't do it. And I have a theory that it's because Koreans have so rejected Neo-Confucianism, because they regard that as being responsible during the Chosun dynasty for Japan being able to occupy Korea, which I think is a great tragedy to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there's so much, and their flag is based on Neo-Confucianism. But Koreans have no interest in, well, actually that's a generalization, but they have so little interest in the Book of Changes. And if you start to discuss it with them, they're going to look at you like, oh, you don't understand that this kind of thinking is responsible for Japanese occupying our country for half a century. I understand that, but it bothers me. And sometimes in conferences, I stand up and try to mention this, and I've been, well, I don't know what to say, but my university didn't appreciate it. So anyway, that's just a couple of things I think you might be interested in exploring. And I'm going to go back and watch your video of this, and a lot of it's very interesting to me. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
You touch on quite a number of things. Let me quickly start with the idea of mot. And also in Dan's, han is also something that you would experience. Basically, every movement should have both mot and han with every breath. So when you breathe in, your body rises up, and you, at that moment where your body rises, the emotional state should be a state of mot, an exuberant state. And then there's this sigh in which the dancer would just kind of fall down, and it's a moment of han in that. So there should be this balance of and yang almost in every movement. Of course, certain dancers will have more mot and other dancers will have more han in the movement. In the martial arts, there's this idea too in martial arts, especially in taekwondo. Taekwondo practitioners say that you should be happy. You should smile while practicing taekwondo. It should feel light and energetic. Nevertheless, every time they execute a technique, there's a drop of the body weight in the technique. And ITF taekwondo, which is my specialty, only because I've done it the longest, there's also a culmination of force happening at the moment of impact. The whole body tenses up, and immediately afterwards, there's a complete sigh, a relax of tension. All the time, there's this oscillation between hard and soft, between receiving and giving, and so on. And martial arts might be a little bit different in the sense that you are not focusing on this particular mental state, but it depends on the martial art. When I speak to the Taekwondo grandmaster, one of them here in Seoul, he always tells me, oh no, you should be smiling, you should be happy while you are doing this. This is not serious. On the other hand, if you were to practice karate in Japan, it's definitely serious. No smiles. We are busy with deadly things here. So the emotional state is very important. I must be honest, I've been reading and researching up on it, but at the same time, I've been kind of keeping my distance from the emotions and philosophy, because I first really wanted to get the kinetic movements grasped before I move into the next aspect. And that will be my next research goal, is to really go into the emotional connotations with the movement, as well as the philosophical expression of the movement. Although I've already done a little bit of that. You mentioned Tai Chi. Tai Chi is very interesting And you can see a different body culture in Tai Chi based on a cyclical notion of the seasons. At the start of your movement, it's like spring, that the blossoms come out. Then you expand your movement in summer. In autumn, the plant starts to retreat again. And in winter, things go underneath. The life force, the Qi goes underneath. So in Tai Chi movements, you see this kind of four-phased movements that expresses in a circle, whereas in the Korean movement, you see some taeguk, that the three-phased expression, movements working according to a triple rhythm rather than a 4-beat rhythm. And then in Japanese movements, depending on the style, you will see something happening on a 1-beat. For instance, you say you practice Gomdo. If you practice the Japanese version of Gomdo, there's just one, it's one strike. Everything should movement at one moment. Or in karate, there's the block punch, a 2-beat structure to the technique. So it's quite interesting, these cultural differences that expresses through rhythm or philosophical notions of the Tao or so on.
Very interesting. Thank you.
John, you made a good point about the recording. We typically have these videos up on the RAS Korea YouTube site by the end of the week of the lecture. So it depends on the time of our available time of our office person, but she's usually pretty able to get those up pretty quickly. So there's another question, Sanko, that's in the chat box. You might want to take a look at that and address that question. Yeah.
Quickly
Please
read this. So you might have seen the movement of Chun Eng Jon. This can be a good example of Korean traditional performance, music, singing, and dancing together. Most movement of core dances expresses the cosmos, like this performance, the Chun Eng Jon. I think basic movements are up and down, right and left, forward and backwards. These 6 directions symbolizes the universe. Yes, so there is, it's again the yang or yin and yang balance that we see in the up and down movements, and left and right. And when I said left and right, this is kind of what I mentioned as a counterbalance. So sometimes you would do the same thing on one side and then on the other side, or simultaneously on both sides. And then she mentions also forward and backwards. In the martial arts, of course, that would be an offensive, an attack, and defensive, a block or retreat. I do agree with this, and with the philosophical notion that this is an expression of yang or taeguk, the yin-yang symbol.
Great. Anybody else? I don't see. Oh, Dagmar, yes, go ahead. Let's unmute your, okay, you've got it. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I've lived in Korea for a long time and I really enjoy looking at Korean dance. I never really thought about the difference with Japan and this these roundish movements, the curved movement, I find very interesting. And I can see how this is different from Japan. I would like to know, could you just briefly say something about, we all think that martial arts are all originated originally in China with Kung Fu and the Wushu arts. And is there a connection between the Chinese martial arts and Chinese dance movements as well? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, maybe very simply, especially for the northern styles, it's very elaborate, very expressive. The circles are very exaggerated, very big. And you see that in both the dance and wushu in the martial arts. Whereas in, let's say, we go to Japan, on the other hand, the movements are much more streamlined. The exaggerated circles are gone. It's very straight lines. So Japan, Okinawa is where karate originated. And as I mentioned earlier, karate used to mean dung hand, a Chinese hand. And so if you look at the Okinawan version of karate, you would see that they have much more circular movements in the kata, in the way they move. Whereas when you go to mainland Japan, where Shintoism was much more prevalent, there's a switch. There's a change into more straight or streamlined movements. So it is somewhat a philosophical and a religious difference. Most people think that in karate, the reason they punch in a straight line is because the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So it's the fastest way to move a technique. But it's probably also very much a cultural aesthetic, because Shintoism, in Shintoism, there's no idea of sin as we have in the West. There's an idea of crookedness versus straightness. So straight and bright is good, crooked and dark is bad. So in the martial arts, in karate, for instance, or in kendo, you want to do a very straight, bright technique. But yeah, so in China, it's more about the grandness of China and thinking of itself as the center of the universe, the middle kingdom, and the biggest kingdom, and so on. And you see these techniques, the Chinese martial techniques, being very exaggerated, very big circles, very fancy acrobatic movements. Of course, there are differences, and especially the southern martial arts are slightly more tighter in the way they express, but it will take quite a long time to differentiate, to go into all the different styles. I don't think we have time for that. But yes, very interesting question.
If there's no one else, I will thank all of you for spending your evening with us tonight.
Seems John has a question.
Do you have a, where?
John, you are muted.
Who has a question?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Okay, John. Yep.
Okay. I didn't get an answer as to why you think that Koreans have such little interest in Tai Chi. I'd be curious because it's really puzzling to me, and you probably have some insights into that.
Yes. So even though I said that taekwondo is based on karate, early Koreans did not know that it was based on karate. It was government propaganda that gave the notion that taekwondo is indigenous to Korea. It has a 2,000-year-old history and so on. And that's why Koreans practiced it. They practiced what they thought were Korean. So after the Japanese occupation, there was a very strong nationalistic drive to do Korean things and not do things from elsewhere, including Japan and Korea. So we see it even in the way that the names in the technique started to change. So in the martial arts, often they would use Hanja, Chinese characters, to describe the movements. And in Taekwondo, they started to take out all the Hanja. Taekyon, for instance, is using just Korean terms, no Sino-Korean terms. And I would guess that the reason is that it's considered as something foreign during that time, because I tried to find books, old books on martial arts, and I have quite a number of old Chinese martial art books in Korean. So books that are published in Korean about Chinese martial arts. And I have quite several of them, but they are pretty old. They are from around the 50s and 60s. But during the Pak Chung-hee era, there was a very strong nationalistic drive to do Korean things. And I think it was because of that particular era that things that were not Korean were kind of moved aside. Now we have a different thing happening. Koreans think that Korean things are outdated. It's not good. It's not interesting. So you see many more Koreans starting to do foreign martial arts. And because of the popularity of UFC, for instance, we see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai being extremely popular among adults. The traditional martial arts as a whole worldwide is dwindling, in part because of the popularity of UFC. So I don't know if it will ever have a comeback again. I must say that I do know some Tai Chi practitioners in Korea, in Seoul. I've visited schools here. So there is a small Tai Chi community, at least in Seoul, that I'm aware of.
I think you're probably right, because I think most Koreans don't know enough about Neo-Confucianism to reject Tai Chi on that basis.
Yeah, interestingly though, the Kuki Taekwondo, Olympic style Taekwondo, the forms are named after these ideas. So the first set of forms is called Palgwe, which is of course based on the Jingyi. And then the later set of forms that they developed were called Teguk, the Teguk Pumse. Yeah, so Taekwondo tried to include some of these philosophical ideas. I don't know if they did it in any successful way, but at least word-wise, there are references to these ideas within Taekwondo tradition.
Yeah, I think that's rather superficial. They know the term. I had a student in my class, and I saw she had her notebook up, and she had the I Ching there and the Korean flag there and the trigrams there. And I said, wow, that must be really interesting. And she looked at me like I was crazy.
Yeah, sometimes when I talk about these Korean philosophical ideas like the I Ching or the Samtaeguk or Taeguk and so on, my students don't know what I'm talking about. They don't know the meaning behind it. I mean, it's familiar to them, it's on the flag, but they don't have any sense of the meaning of it. Yeah, I don't know if it's taught at all. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, I hope you will encourage it, because it's kind of national tragedy, in my opinion.
Okay, we need to bring this to a close. Thank you very much for some interesting questions and the discussion. If you are in Seoul, we invite you to look at our walking lecture schedule, either on our Facebook page or the website. Our next lecture will be in 2 weeks on Tuesday, November 24th, 7:30 p.m. Join us for a presentation by Mark Caprio, who will tell us all about Lieutenant Colonel Willis Byrd, who flew to Seoul on August 18th, 1945, 3 days after the Japanese surrender. In the months leading up to his mission, Byrd had been involved in the ambitious Eagle project that trained Koreans for, quote, irregular warfare, unquote, tactics to be conducted behind enemy lines along the Korean peninsula. Lots of questions surround Byrd and his mission to Seoul in 1945. Be sure to tune in next time. We look forward to seeing you then. Once again, Dr. Lewis, thank you very much for your time and informative lecture tonight. Folks, have a good evening.
By the way, is that going to be online, the next one?
Yes, it'll all be on Zoom. Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.